Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sunday Musings. And today the question is, are Mormons, or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the best breeders? Or are we failing too, along with everybody else? Well, what does it mean to fail? Let's maybe start by giving this question some context. So since 2007, the birth rate in the United States of America has declined by 19%. In the U.S., in 2014, for example, almost half of women between the ages of 18 and 39 had no children. This was just a decade ago. Numbers are probably a little worse since then. So again, 18 to 39, almost half of women in this age bracket had no children at all. By their mid-40s, which is customarily considered the end of your childbearing years if you're a woman, about 1 in 7, 14%, never had any kids. Again, this was a decade ago, so it's probably even more significant than that. Now, if the average number of children per couple declines below 2.1, that's what's called the population replacement rate. So the size of the population overall starts to fall. Why 2.1 rather than 2? If you got a male and a female and a mom and a dad, why isn't 2 kids enough to replace you? Well, it's because not everyone lives till old age. So 2.1 ends up being the global average fertility rate needed just for population replacement, 2.1. Well, you've got countries like China that are 1.3. We'll get into that with some examples a little bit later. In the U.S., it's 1.6. So the United States currently is below the population replacement rate. The largest 15 countries by GDP all have a fertility rate below the population replacement rate. So the number of the people on the planet is likely going to peak. Estimates suggest currently around 9.7 billion people around 2064, so 4 decades from now. Then it's going to fall to about 8.8 billion by the end of the century. So there's going to be a peak as we kind of catch up and the younger people finish having all their kids, but the younger and younger people are having fewer and fewer, and so we're going to start to decline in about 40 years. Now, even more astounding than this is that global fertility has halved. It's been cut in half, while the number of women in the reproductive age bracket has tripled since 1950. So you got the boomers and everyone's having a bunch of kids, and now there's triple the amount of women in this reproductive age category. And yet despite this voluminous increase in the population, and especially in women during childbearing years, global fertility has been cut in half. Now in the U.S., the total fertility rate is converging to that of other high-income countries after decades of being an outlier. So the U.S. was an anomaly compared to other high-income countries. So in 2020, for example, in the U.K., the population replacement rate, the total fertility rate, was 1.56. Again, below that population replacement rate of 2.1. In Canada, it was 1.4. In the European Union, it was 1.5. In Japan, it was 1.34. Almost a full child less than what is needed, which is why Japan's population is imploding right now. So the U.S. is now converging these high-income countries. My theory is because of increased and rampant secularization in the United States, which traditionally was a more Christian, pro-family country, and now it's been degraded into this secular state compared to a lot of the other countries. It's not as bad yet as some of those other countries, but we're catching up, and the delta has closed. There's this study that came out a few years ago from the Aspen Institute. It's called The Causes and Consequences of Declining U.S. Fertility. And as they did this study, and they were talking to all these people and trying to dig into why is the fertility rate in the United States declining, their conclusion is that it's likely not due to greater access to contraception or increased housing costs, increased childcare costs, higher wages, higher employment, student debt. Instead, this is what they said they felt it was due to: changing norms regarding the intensity of parenting. These might change prospective parents' decisions on how many children to have or whether to have children at all. Such changes are particularly relevant in an era where parents, including mothers, work longer hours outside the home, clashing with career aspirations or a desire for more leisure time. This idea, they continued, may incorporate choice in the context of trading off how many children parents want to have with how much they want to, quote unquote, invest in those children. Now, this paper was titled The Cost and Consequences of Declining U.S. Fertility. So now that we have the context for our question, how Mormons are doing, we'll get into that in a second. What are the consequences of declining fertility? Why is it such a big deal if the total fertility rate is less than the population replacement rate of 2.1? Well, we'll get into the consequences in a little bit. The cultural attitudes to me is a little bit interesting here when it comes to this issue. I stumbled upon this quote as one example from 1905. This is President Theodore Roosevelt, so over 120 years ago. He declared that women without children were, quote, one of the most unpleasant and unwholesome features of modern life, and worthy of contempt, as hardy as any visited upon the soldier who runs away in battle. So this is just a single anecdote and example of what was for millennia, you might say, if not for a very long time, this cultural reinforcement of the importance of motherhood and this core function for women that this postmodern society has increasingly shunned out of some sort of feminist desire for equality that, leads women into the workforce to become tax and wage slaves like the rest of us. You really have to question if what they've fought for is really the ideal way to structure society. But this cultural reinforcement has been chipped away, and so what we do have is a declining fertility rate in the United States. There's a few reasons, I think, for that, in addition to the changing norms, as the Aspen Institute's article put it, around people's perception of what's worth to invest in children compared to career. For birth control, we can look at 2018. I found some data. 65% of women in the United States aged 15 to 49 were using a contraceptive method. Almost all women who were sexually active, or 99%, will have used one type of birth control in their life. And the states with the highest use of birth control for women who are, quote-unquote, at risk, this is from the Guttmacher Institute, Guttmacher, however you pronounce it, and they're kind of a pro-abortion research institute. They said that women who are, quote, at risk of becoming pregnant, they make it sound like an infectious disease. The states with the highest use of birth control for women in this age bracket included Utah and Oregon, states with very polar opposite political orientations, and yet Utah made the list of the top 2 states for the use of birth control. So, of course, across the country, in the past half century plus, birth control has been widely and increasingly available and used, allowing for the convenience of sexual escapades without the consequences of having children, in many cases, if your birth control is working. Of course, abortions have been a way to decline the total fertility rate with women, mothers killing their own babies. In 2020, for example, there were 930,000 abortions in the United States. This, by the way, does not account for abortion pills that were obtained outside of clinical settings. This is just clinical data that Guttmacher Institute could identify based on available data. And so when you consider the far broader population of people using these abortion pills, that 930,000 number is likely to increase substantially. This number, by the way, of abortions peaked in 1991 when there were 1.5 million abortions, which is about 2/3 more than what it is in 2020. So there has been a steady decline. That could be for various reasons, less intimacy, it could be, any number. It could be the birth control as well. But abortions have declined relative to the peak in 1991. Another reason why the total fertility rate could be declining is because of new technology that allows women to freeze their eggs. I'll share a story in a little bit about at least one woman who regrets what happened and the way that she, on this pro-feminist crusade, went into the workforce and thought that she was basically buying an insurance policy for future children, only to come out with some regret. There's some data that suggests that in the U.S., egg freezing retrievals increased by 40% from before the pandemic. So there was kind of a boom of people during the pandemic using this technology. Shady Grove Fertility, they run 36 of these clinics throughout the eastern seaboard. They saw a 50% increase in women freezing their eggs since 2019. Doctors at NYU Langone saw 41% year-over-year increase in women freezing their eggs. And in Seattle, the Seattle Reproductive Medicine, they conducted 289 egg freezing cycles in 2020 compared with 242 in 19, a nearly 20% jump. Research from 2021 suggests that women who undergo elective egg freezing are commonly single, between 36 and 40 years of age, Caucasian with higher education and employment. Perhaps no surprise, in part because the cost for this procedure is about $10,000 to $20,000 in the United States. Some of these women working in like high-tech jobs are offered as a perk from their companies the ability to pay for egg freezing, which, whatever. Probably not many companies that do that, but that's kind of crazy. All right, so let's get to our question. How do Mormons stack up in all of this? We've established the context. We've looked at some of the reasons why the total fertility rate may be declining. How exactly do members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it's a mouthful, how do Mormons stack up compared to people around the country? Well, the Cooperative Election Study, this was in 2020, the data that I have, it was a survey of about 50,000 people throughout the country, which if you understand how surveying works and polling works, that's a very robust sample size, extremely robust to try and assess the overall preferences and demographics of the entire country. So 50, you might say, oh, but there's X number of people in America, however many now, 300 million or whatever. But the way sampling and surveys works, this is a very representative sample of the country, and so from that we're able to derive some very interesting insights, including this one, where again, as of 2020, the average number of children for 35 to 45-year-olds, well, the national average was 2.06, which is under that 2.1 population replacement rate. But when you look at Mormons, we take the lead, right? Above Muslims, above Orthodox, above Protestants, Catholics, who are, traditionally opposed to birth control and supportive of large families. They're barely at the population replacement rate. So Mormons win here at 2.8. Now, after childbearing years are over, because keep in mind that data was for women aged 35 to 45, so a lot of women aren't done having kids yet. Some haven't even started. So when childbearing years are over, Mormons end up around a 3.4 average. This is using data as of 2015 from another very robust national survey. This is coming from Pew Research Center, but Mormons landing at 3.4, over and above the Catholics, who end up at 2.3, just barely above the population replacement rate, above the Protestants, Jews, certainly atheists and agnostics as well. Half of atheists and agnostics never reproduce at all. For these groups to grow, they basically have to rely on conversion more than retention, because half of them aren't having kids. So if agnostics want there to be more agnostics, if they think that, or if atheists want to preach their atheism, if they want to grow, they basically have to recruit new people constantly, because half of them aren't having kids. And perhaps no surprise, Mormons are having babies at an earlier age than people of other religions, peaking only below the Hindu when it comes to whether they're a parent or a guardian of a child 18 or younger. For the Hindu, they peak just after the age of 40, whereas Mormons are taking the lead in their mid to late 20s, while everyone else is kind of waiting. So you can see, if you look at the chart, that Mormons are much more likely to be having children at a younger age and getting that earlier start on a family. Perhaps no surprise, because the data shows they're also marrying typically younger than most people in the country. Now, you might think, okay, well, how does birth control play into this? We talked earlier about how Utah was apparently one of the leading states for use of birth control at so-called at-risk populations for women who are at risk of getting pregnant. From the BYU Religious Studies Center, they say that Mormons are just as likely as the national population to use modern methods of birth control at some point in their life. For Mormons, however, contraceptive use is often delayed until after child rearing has begun, and frequency of use is lowered in order to obtain the larger desired family size. So, Mormons are more eager to have kids at a younger age. They're using birth control maybe to space the kids out a little bit, and not get pregnant so soon, right after having a previous child, or to, they're probably getting sterilized less. The church manual does discourage permanent sterilization, like a vasectomy or getting your tubes tied. So it could be that there's a lot of members of the church who, heeding that counsel, rely on birth control as a way to, stop having kids after their, third or fourth or whatever, when they decide to conclude. And so, yes, the simple answer to our question is Mormons are the best breeders. However, we're being graded on a curve. When I started Libertas Institute, my organization here in Utah, I would go around to a lot of potential donors trying to solicit their support for what we were doing. And in the early days, a lot of the response that I got was, well, this is Utah. It's a conservative state. Why do we need this free market think tank in a state that wins all these awards? Utah was winning, best governed state, best managed budget, best place to live, best, lowest overall taxes or whatever. There were all these accolades and awards that Utah was getting. And because of these awards, I would have potential donors decline supporting our work because they didn't see the need. And so the answer that I would often give to them is that, you remember in the 8th grade when you got an A on your math test, but when you got it back, you saw that you actually got 79% out of 100 because you were being graded on a curve, right? It wasn't that you actually got a 90% or above. It was that your teacher decided, for whatever reason, right? It's a hard test or a stupid class or whatever. We're going to grade on a curve, and you're going to be graded relative to your peers. Rather than based on your own performance, you're going to be, the subjectivity of how we determine the score is going to be modified based on how your peers are doing. So Utah, sure, was winning all these awards, but that doesn't mean we're perfect as a state. It just means we don't suck as bad as everybody else. But if everybody sucks, then, what is it to be a least sucky state? There's clearly room for improvement. I think it's the same with this issue. Sure, Mormons win. We're having, more kids overall, but it's, declining. And having more kids than others as a relative comparison to our peers from other religions or no religion doesn't really mean that we're fully doing what we ought. It doesn't mean that we're fully heeding the commandments. It doesn't mean that we're not being influenced by the society in which we live that is sliding in this direction. What President Hinckley called taking on the slow stain of the world. I'm going to be doing a musing on that in the next few months. The slow stain of the world. Well, what is that? Actually, before I get on to the next thing, younger Mormons are more likely to say than older Mormons that 0, 1, or 2 children is ideal. 0, 1, or 2. So for younger Mormons, 46% agree that 0, 1, or 2 children is ideal, whereas for older Mormons, only 32%. So almost half compared to about a third. So you can see that the younger generation is buying into this societal narrative, is growing up in this society where these perceptions exist. They're being influenced by that. They're, ascribing to older generations this concept of having tons of children, though they're being subject to influences we'll talk about in just a minute. Consequently, they're increasingly supporting smaller families. Thus, I think the future of the LDS Church, absent some radical shift, is going to be that we slide down towards those of other faiths and end up below the population replacement rate, perhaps, as well. So what is the commandment? Well, the commandment is pretty frank. It's simple. You know it. This isn't, mind-blowing new information coming from the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, 28. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. The Hebrew word for replenish, meaning to fill. Multiply, have babies, fill the earth. This commandment, of course, has never been rescinded. It's never been amended. There's no asterisks. Right from the first chapter of the Bible, God giving this clear command. Of course, we have this in modern revelation and Moses and Abraham with God saying this stuff as well. But beyond that clear commandment from God, church leaders past and present have often commented on that commandment and expounded upon it. Especially speaking against things like birth control back when they also spoke out against abortion. I did a musing, I don't know, a year ago or so. You can find it at sundaymusings.org. Search abortion and the little filter drop down to find that one if you didn't listen to it, where I document how there's been a massive drop-off in the public mentions, the discussions of the topic of abortion by our church leaders, where, in the Roe v. Wade in the 70s, it was, hot and heavy, and we're hearing it over the pulpit, and then it just starts declining to the point of almost hearing nothing, which leads a lot of young Mormons to then take on the slow stain of the world, which is pro-choice, so-called, and therefore more and more younger Mormons end up supporting abortion. So church leaders used to speak out a lot about abortion. They also used to speak out a lot about birth control as well, but it was contextualized in this broader desire and perception that we need to fulfill this commandment to multiply and replenish the earth. Joseph Smith in 1835, he spoke of the blessings to multiply and replenish with the addition of long life and posterity. Now, after Joseph, when polygamy reared its ugly head, and if you want to see my thoughts on polygamy and why I think the purported revelations around it are problematic, again, you can go to sundaymusings.org and search for polygamy, and you'll find that one. But when the Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young and all these guys are trying to justify polygamy and blame it all on Joseph, who with Emma and Hiram were persistently trying to fight it and make it stop, these leaders tied polygamy to the commandment to multiply and replenish the earth as a further justification for polygamy. Brigham Young, for example, said that this, meaning the commandment to multiply and replenish the earth, this is the reason why the doctrine of plurality or polygamy was revealed, that noble spirits which are waiting for tabernacles might be brought forth. In other words, we've been commanded to multiply and replenish the earth, and so God in this last dispensation has commanded us to be polygamists so that we could have even more sex and therefore even more babies and therefore replenish the earth even more quickly. Orson Pratt, he said that the object of marriage is to multiply the species according to the command of God. A woman with one husband can fulfill this command with greater facilities than if she had a plurality, but a plurality of wives would be the means of greatly increasing a family, and of thus fulfilling the command not only to a far greater extent on the part of the husband, but also on the part of the females who otherwise might have been under the necessity of remaining single forever. Of course, there were plenty of teachings around this that didn't pertain to polygamy. Brigham Young said that there are multitudes of pure and holy spirits waiting to take tabernacles. Now, what is our duty? He said, to prepare tabernacles for them, to take a course that will not tend to drive those spirits into the families of the wicked, where they will be trained in wickedness, debauchery, and every species of crime. It is the duty of every righteous man and woman to prepare tabernacles for all the spirits they can. This was a popular teaching at the time, that there's all these spirits waiting for bodies. We need to give them righteous families and opportunities to come into a believing household. Apostle Abraham Woodruff in 1900 said that there is a certain class of Latter-day Saints that have come to think as the Gentile world does, that it is not stylish, not nice to have large families, and therefore we find, much to our sorrow, that in some instances steps are being taken to prevent these spirits being tabernacled by them. This is 120 years ago. He was noting the tendency of some Latter-day Saints to think like the society around them on this issue. Well, Abraham Woodruff, in his remarks, this is in General Conference, he hoped that some of the older members, he said, I hope that some of the older members of this quorum or the presidency might address the topic. This prompted President Joseph F. Smith to say in the same year, 1900, the following, quote, "Those who have taken upon themselves the responsibility of wedded life should see to it that they do not abuse the course of nature. They do not destroy the principle of life within them, nor violate any of the commandments of God. The command which he gave in the beginning to multiply and replenish the earth is still in force upon the children of men. Possibly no greater sin could be committed by the people who have embraced this gospel than to prevent or to destroy life in the manner indicated." Basically, commentary against both birth control and abortion, and just, not having children and opting out of having more. Interestingly, that as the Mormon birth rate declined, So also did the frequency of church leaders talking about the issue about birth control or the duty to have large families. As I mentioned with abortion, so too with this topic, that commentary really just dropped off around it. In 1956, we have President Joseph Fielding Smith writing in his book, Doctrines of Salvation, the following. When a man and a woman are married and they agree or covenant to limit their offspring to 2 or 3 and practice devices, this is birth control, to accomplish this purpose, they are guilty of iniquity, which eventually must be punished. Unfortunately, this evil doctrine is being taught as a virtue by many people who consider themselves cultured and highly educated. It has even crept in among members of the church and has been advocated in some of the classes within the church. It should be understood definitely that this kind of doctrine is not only not advocated by the authorities of the church, but also is condemned by them as wickedness in the sight of the Lord. 2 years later, we have Bruce McConkie in his 1958 edition of Mormon Doctrine. You may recall some of the controversy around this, and he was later forced to make some edits and issue a new version. In the 1958 edition, that book stated that anyone using condoms or other artificial contraception are, quote, in rebellion against God and are guilty of gross wickedness. Then we go forward about a decade, now 1969, the first presidency now commenting on this issue. This is the first formal statement on birth control since 1918. It's also the only formal discussion of the subject ever published by the first presidency as a whole. 1969. This said the following. We seriously regret that there should exist a sentiment or feeling among any members of the church to curtail the birth of their children. We've been commanded to multiply and replenish the earth that we may have joy and rejoicing in our posterity. Where husband and wife enjoy health and vigor and are free from impurities that would be entailed upon their posterity, it is contrary to the teachings of the church artificially to curtail or prevent the birth of children. We believe that those who practice birth control will reap disappointment by and by. So lots of commentary. Interestingly, talking about people who are curtailing birth, people who are going to reap disappointment. Well, one example of someone reaping disappointment was this story that I teased earlier regarding freezing eggs. In 2014, a woman named Bridget Adams was featured on the cover of Bloomberg Business Week magazine under the banner title, Freeze Your Eggs, Free Your Career. I'm going to read from a more recent article commenting about her story. Bridget was single and blonde, a Vassar graduate who spoke fluent Italian and was working in tech marketing for a number of prestigious companies. Her story was one of empowerment, how a new fertility procedure was giving women more choices, as the magazine noted provocatively, quote, in the quest to have it all. Adams, the cover girl, remembers feeling a wonderful sense of freedom after she froze her eggs in her late 30s despite the $19,000 cost. Her plan was to work a few more years, find a great guy to marry, and still have a house full of her own children. Things didn't turn out the way she hoped. In early 2017, with her 45th birthday looming and no sign of Mr. Right, she decided to start a family on her own. She excitedly unfroze the 11 eggs she had stored and selected a sperm donor. 2 eggs failed to survive the thawing process. 3 more failed to fertilize. That left 6 embryos, of which 5 appeared to be abnormal. The last one was implanted in her uterus. On the morning of March 7th, she got the devastating news that it, too, had failed. Adams was not pregnant, and her chances of carrying her genetic child had just dropped to near zero. She remembers screaming like a, quote, wild animal, throwing books, papers, her laptop, and collapsing to the ground. Quote, this is quoting Adams, "It was one of the worst days of my life. There were so many emotions. I was sad, I was angry, I was ashamed. I questioned, why me? What did I do wrong?" So again, going to the First Presidency statement from 1969, people reaping disappointment by engaging in this type of overall birth control. Granted, hers was different. She didn't have a husband. She was just freezing her own eggs. But as part of this broader approach towards delaying childbearing, not prioritizing marriage and family at younger ages, instead prioritizing other things like career. Okay, so that 1969 First Presidency statement, that was a revision of a statement made over half a century prior by Joseph F. Smith as president of the church. This, by the way, was the same year that Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, launched the Birth Control Review as a magazine or periodical, and served a month in prison for opening the nation's first birth control clinic. Horribly racist and eugenicist woman, but this is the context, 1917, and so there's a lot of chatter around this issue, leading President Joseph F. Smith to state the following. So you'll see about 85% of the text is the same as the later 1969 First Presidency Statement, the excerpt that I read, but he has a little bit more strenuous language here. Again, 1917, he says, "I regret, I think it is a crying evil that there should exist a sentiment or a feeling among any members of the church to curtail the birth of their children. I think that is a crime wherever it occurs, where husband and wife are in possession of health and vigor and are free from impurities that would be entailed upon their posterity. I believe that where people undertake to curtail or prevent the birth of their children, that they are going to reap disappointment by and by." A lot of that's old language, or rather from the 1969 statement half a century prior. But then he adds, I'm saying this wrong. He also has this next sentence in his statement, which is not in the 1969 version. "I have no hesitancy in saying that I believe that is one of the greatest crimes of the world today, this evil practice." So again, a lot of similarities. In 1969, they toned down and excluded a little bit the more opinion-related things. I think it's a crying evil. I think it's a crime. I have no hesitancy in saying I believe it's one of the greatest crimes of today, this evil practice. Of course, there's leaders more recently who have commented on this. Fewer than before. Again, that decline in public references about this. But Dallin Oaks in 2018 said that Satan's most strenuous opposition is directed at whatever is most important to God's plan, and that this opposition includes seeking to discourage childbearing, especially by parents who will raise children in truth. There are leaders outside of our church, certainly, who have commented on this. You've got Pope Francis, for example, a gentleman I disagree with profoundly on a number of issues, political in nature especially, but he called this reduced or postponed childbearing a, quote, form of selfishness. And I think he's right. I think it's narcissism in the extreme. What is narcissism? It's an excessive interest in one's self. It's a self-focused and ego-based, prioritizing yourself personally over other people, over relationships, your own family. Funny enough, I came across an example from a website called Self. I don't know if it's a magazine or something. It is a magazine. Self, which has this article: 10 women look back on living child-free by choice. What they see, a lot of time and travel, not a lot of regret. Here's a quote from one of them. "While some people look at me pityingly, I am thrilled with my life and my decision not to have children. I have choices so many of my friends and acquaintances don't, because I don't have the financial and time obligations that result from having children. People say I'm selfish, but how is it selfish to not bring children into a world which already has plenty?" Again, you can see kind of the mindset, the brainwashing, the societal stain that has infected women like this to see children as a burden, that they want to be liberated in this kind of postmodern feminist approach, to be unshackled from being so-called barefoot and pregnant, and being, condemned to the kitchen to just pump out babies. What's ultimately happening here, though, is a disobeying of God's clear commandment for people to multiply and replenish the earth. I just thought it was especially funny coming from a magazine titled Self to have this very, what Pope Francis called selfish approach to reducing or postponing childbearing. All right, so what are the consequences of all this? Why does any of it matter? Why should we care? Big whoop. You want to have one kid, knock yourself out. Why is this a topic of concern? Well, interestingly, 23 nations, including countries like Spain and Japan, are expected to see their populations cut in half by 2100. That is not that far away. China, for example, could go from 1.4 billion people to 700 million by the year 2100. They, of course, having decades ago the one-child policy and really trying to limit out of a need for limiting mouths to feed in a centrally planned communist state. But now they're reaping the whirlwind. Their government, by the way, in 2021, Communist China just announced that parents would now be permitted, not encouraged, permitted to have up to 3 children. So they're now raising the limit. They recognize the population problem for their country, and they want to avoid the problem by encouraging and permitting more childbearing. Last October, Xi Jinping in China said that his country needs to actively cultivate a new culture of marriage and childbearing. We need to strengthen our guidance on marriage, childbirth, and family planning for our youths. We need to promote and implement pro-fertility policies and improve the quality of our human capital while taking care of our aging population. Basically, like, please have more kids because our communist state, this pyramid scheme, requires a lot of productive labor to support this aging population. Found some examples on social media, commentary from people in China. Here's a couple. One person said that when it comes to having children, I don't have a shred of desire, only fear. The downsides of having children far exceed the upsides. By not having kids, I only need to worry about my retirement. Another person in China said, not having kids means I can spend all my money on myself. I can take an overseas vacation whenever I like, sleep in on the weekends, and go out drinking late at night. That beats worrying about my kids day in and day out. So, not shocking there, but emblematic of the selfishness that we see, the narcissism of people who are disobeying God's commandment. Countries are also going to, as a result of all this, age dramatically, with as many people turning 80 as there are being born. So typically you've always had this kind of pyramid with a broad population base above the replacement rate, where you have a lot of young people and then fewer and fewer old children. But now in these countries that are turning lopsided, you have as many 80-year-olds as you do babies, and it's unsustainable financially. You have this inverted age structure, increasingly of more old people and fewer younger people. So you're going to have this equilibrium where there will be as many 80-year-olds as babies, but then it's going to continue going the other way, and you're going to have way more older people than you will have babies. Who pays taxes in a world like that? Who pays for Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare and these other pyramid scheme programs that rely upon the productive class to be larger in number than the beneficiaries of people sucking at the teat of the government? Who looks after the elderly? Will people still be able to retire from work and rely on these types of benefits? This is from The Economist, interesting article that said that younger people have more of what psychologists call fluid intelligence, the ability to think creatively so as to solve problems in entirely new ways. This youthful dynamism complements the accumulated knowledge of older workers. It also brings change. Patents filed by the youngest inventors are much more likely to cover breakthrough innovations. Older countries, and it turns out they're young people, are less enterprising and less comfortable taking risks. Elderly electorates ossify politics too, because the old benefit less than the young when economies grow. They've proved less keen on pro-growth policies, especially house building. Creative destruction is likely to be rare in aging societies, suppressing productivity growth in ways that compound into an enormous missed opportunity. So this isn't just an issue with not having enough people to pay for Social Security. It's about basically imploding a country from within by depriving it of entrepreneurial vigor and risk-taking and changing the status quo. You get these old people who just want to protect their own status quo and maintain things as they always have been, to the detriment of the younger population, who then look at the system and see how the deck is stacked against them and throw up their hands and say, why would I raise a children in an environment like this? How is this going to work? I need to focus on me. Look at these older people, how they're struggling. It's going to be even worse for me. I need to focus on myself, my own retirement. I can't have these dependents and other people relying on me. I need to focus on myself. And so it's, as the article says, it's a compounding problem where the fertility rate dropping deprives the populace of this youthful dynamism and this risk-taking and this innovation, which just further compounds the problem, and then it gets worse over time. I found this just this morning from Hungary. They're trying to fight back, not like in China, just permitting another child or having this platitude statement and saying, hey, we need to have more kids. In Hungary, they're actually giving a lifetime personal income tax exemption for women who give birth and raise at least 4 children. They're actually also giving them subsidies of thousands of dollars to buy a minivan once they have their 3rd kid, a low-interest loan for women under 40 who are marrying for the first time. A third of the debt is forgiven when a second child is born, and the entire loan is waived after the third child. And then also a loan program for families with at least 2 children to help them buy homes. Do I like this? No, of course not. Government's involved. They're using taxpayer dollars. They're using the tax code to incentivize and therefore manipulate their populace. I just find it interesting that it's happening at all, and you can see that these political leaders are realizing that they are at the helm of an unsustainable system and that the ship is going to crash if they don't do something about it. And so you get some kind of enterprising politicians who are trying to throw money at the problem and hope that that incentivizes people to procreate more. Now, this push for decreased fertility, we talked about the context, the historical context, some of the reasons for it, what church leaders have said about it, that Mormons are kind of at the top of being graded on a curve when it comes to the fertility rate. We've talked about the consequences of the issue. Well, where's this push coming from? I've talked a little bit about this in past musings, that so much of the recent push is things like climate anxiety. You get articles like this one from The Guardian that says, want to fight climate change? Have fewer children. Or this one from NBC that says, science proves kids are bad for Earth. Morality suggests we stop having them. Further says that we need to stop pretending kids don't have environmental and ethical consequences. Now, in 2021, Pew Research Center did a survey of childless adults without children. 5% of them cited as a specific reason for not having children that it was because of climate change or the environment. In a letter to investors last year, Morgan Stanley, they had some analysis to note that this, quote, movement to not have children owing to fears over climate change is growing and impacting fertility rates quicker than any preceding trend in the field of fertility decline. So 5%, but growing and soon going to overtake some of the other reasons. According to one study, this is from the Washington Post, according to one study, the emissions reduction from having one fewer child dwarfs all other individual actions. So with all this climate hysteria and all this societal narrative about, going to carbon neutral and reducing your carbon footprint and fighting climate change and all this nonsense, because it is nonsense, it's all Marxist crap. These people are looking at charts like this one that show that having one fewer child completely dwarfs all the other things that people who are concerned about climate change often consider doing or do in fact do to quote-unquote fight climate change, such as not using vehicles, living car-free, avoiding transatlantic flights, buying green energy, buying a more efficient car, using an electric car, eating a plant-based diet, replacing gasoline with a hybrid, right? All these things that responsible people try and do. And then they look at a chart like this that says, oh, having a child has more of an impact on your carbon footprint than all of those things combined throughout your lifetime. And so then they, who have been brainwashed into being, fearful of carbon dioxide, which is ridiculous because it's, plant food to make our Earth greener and warmer and more productive. They look at this chart and think, oh, I better have fewer children. There have been people who end relationships over this. Here's this story from Laurel, a 33-year-old from Wisconsin, who asked to be identified only by her first name in this article. She divorced her first husband partly because he wanted to have children, and she, worried about a climate-changed future, didn't want to. Quote, with the uncertainty of the world right now, it doesn't feel safe. I wouldn't want to subject my children to that. She's now remarried to a man who also wants to be child-free. Okay, so I could go deeper on that. There's a big rabbit hole of all these nincompoops who believe stupid stuff like this. The point is that this is a growing trend, as the Morgan Stanley analysts pointed out. And so more and more people are arguing and believing and acting upon this idea that humans are basically a parasite on the earth and that we need to have fewer of them. Mormons are not immune. Interestingly, just a few years ago, there was a survey of Latter-day Saints that found that just 10% of them say that they're worried about climate change. And so compared to the broader population, that's a huge discrepancy. However, when you look at younger Latter-day Saints, they're much more likely to buy into this societal narrative. They've been propagandized so heavily in the schools and social media and from peers, TikTok and everything else, to buy into this narrative, just as has been the case with abortion and LGBTQIA plus and everything else. I think it's my prediction that these younger Mormons are going to increasingly buy into this, and because of climate anxiety and other reasons, they're going to have fewer and fewer children, and that the top rank that Mormons currently have may decline. We may lose that spot to people from a different religion, because I think the younger Latter-day Saints are buying into these narratives, and church leaders are not really commenting that much about it like they used to. You could argue that we've been warned already, just like with secret combinations and preparedness and all these different things that we don't really hear as much on anymore. And the saints didn't listen. Therefore, the Lord has shut the mouth of the prophets and said, okay, I'm taking away further light and knowledge, and you're getting less. Perhaps that's the explanation as to why we don't have more statements encouraging Latter-day Saints to have more children. I'll end with two quotes, though, that I think are relevant here. One recent, one less so. J. Reuben Clark, this is over half a century ago, said that the Latter-day Saints believe in large families wherever it is possible to provide for the necessities of life, for the health and education of their children, and when the physical and mental health of the mother permits. That is a fairly good summary of what church leaders throughout the 20th century were saying on this topic, with some of the statements like Joseph F. Smith's being a little bit more emphatic and barbed than others. More recently, you have Elder Bednar. He gave a talk first remarking about how Samuel the Lamanite noted that the more part of the people were in the path of their duty, walking circumspectly before God, etc., etc. And so in this address, Elder Bednar talks about being in the path of our duty and gives several examples, one of which is, he says, the phrase, in the path of their duty, describes faithful married men and women who honor their covenant responsibility to multiply and replenish the earth in an increasingly confused world, beset with calamities and misplaced priorities. These courageous souls heed not the secular voices extolling self-centeredness. They reverence the sanctity and importance of life in Heavenly Father's plan of happiness for His children. Mic drop. That message probably needs to be stated in every single general conference to counteract the societal stain and these false narratives that many younger Latter-day Saints and Latter-day Saints of every age are increasingly absorbing and believing. Going back to 1900, when you had, who was it, the Apostle Woodruff talking about there's a certain class of Latter-day Saints that have come to think, as the Gentile world does, that it's not stylish, not nice to have large families. Therefore, we find much to our sorrow that in some instances steps are being taken to prevent these spirits from being tabernacled by them. We don't really have church leaders condemning birth control per se as much. Mormons clearly are using birth control and yet still doing it as a way to just manage their larger families, larger than most, our peers, but still using it to limit the number of children overall. And so this message from Elder Bednar echoes messages that we've heard for quite some time that build upon that commandment to multiply and replenish the earth. The church doesn't have a position on how many children each person should have. It's clearly up to them and the Lord. Really, the point here and the emphasis is to reject what Elder Bednar calls the secular voices extolling self-centeredness. Pope Francis was right when he said that same thing. You look at all these examples, and there's a level of narcissism and self-centeredness that pervades all of these examples. They're increasingly focused on themselves. They're rejecting God's commandment. They're not sacrificing, and they're not willing to kind of invest in their own long-term joy and happiness. They're focused on that self-centered, short-term, instant or more rapid gratification than you would get from having a large posterity. So yes, Mormons are the best breeders compared to other people, but it's not guaranteed that we stay winning the gold medal here by any stretch of the imagination. But also winning the gold medal when everyone is doing poorly isn't the greatest of feats. You could argue that 3.4 number or 2.8 of average number of children that Mormon families have is still too low. Or maybe it's fine. 3.4, that's pretty healthy and ample. But everything is declining. Increased secularization across the world, and I think, compounding this, and I've talked a little bit about this in the past, you even look at things like the Federal Reserve and monetary policy and people's savings being debased with soft money. And so when you're losing all your money and you're trying to keep up, you're increasingly focused on yourself. Whereas if, societies that have had hard money, something like a gold standard, you're able to preserve your wealth over a longer span of time and therefore invest in your future and think about your children and your grandchildren. So we live in a society where the financial system itself is conducive towards pushing people, incentivizing them to be focused on themselves. Think if you were in hyperinflationary Venezuela, right, or Zimbabwe a few years ago, and every day the prices are doubling, if not more, or Weimar Germany, or all these, Hungary, all these countries that have experienced hyperinflation. Well, if every day the currency is losing half of its value, or, whatever the percentage is, rapidly losing its value, you're increasingly focused on just surviving day to day. You're thinking very short term because your money is losing value very quickly. So why am I talking about money and inflation in the central banking year? The point is that there are many influences pressuring young people today to be self-centered. It's not just that they're inherently stupid or inherently evil or whatever. They're growing up in a society that is increasingly cultivating a culture of self-centeredness, not just from a traditionally cultural perspective through, celebrities and Hollywood or whatever, but also, again, like things like the financial system and the political system and all of these things compounding together to produce an attitude of disinterest in having children or in having fewer children, or the political propaganda from climate change and all this stuff. All of these pressures exerted on young people, it's little surprise perhaps that many of them are responding this way and concluding that they should have fewer children because they see that the deck has been stacked against them, and the older societies ossifying politics, wanting to guard the status quo, are kind of keeping younger people strong-armed into their crappier circumstances. Oh, you can't buy a house despite working 3 jobs because of inflation, and house prices are crazy, and we older people have manipulated the legal systems to deprive home builders from being able to construct more homes, which would increase the supply and therefore lower prices. So you're screwed, but hey, I benefit because my mortgage is paid off and I got what's good for me. It's very protectionist, right? Large companies, they start to engage in protectionist activities to hold off competitors. So too with these older generations. Again, one of those compounding consequences of when you have fewer and fewer children, as is happening in the United States, where we're already below the population replacement rate, you get an increasingly older population that wants to protect what it is accumulated to the detriment of their own children and the rising generation. So this isn't just, oh, shucks, we need to have more kids to bring more righteous souls into good, Latter-day Saint Christian families. That too, I think that's a valid argument, but there are serious consequences here if, as a society, we continue towards this trend. And I get a little worried for my own kids to live in a society like that, and myself in a few decades, and just think about what is going to happen in our world if these trends are not reversed. Maybe some countries like Hungary, financially incentivizing people will help. I doubt that it will be anything more than marginal impact, because so much of these cultural reinforcements and societal pressures are bearing down on people. And unless we have, the Elon Musks and others of the world popularizing a pro-fertility attitude, and that pervades our culture, I don't see this really changing. So I'd be curious in the comments, for those of you watching on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, if you want to let me know your thoughts on this. This is a topic, I think, of massive import that we don't talk enough about in the church. We've kind of inherited this traditional culture in the church of having larger families, but I'm the oldest of 4 boys, but in my family, we only have 2 children, and that was the right thing for various reasons I'm not going to share. But a lot of members of the church, we, over time, in past years, have heard of much larger families, and increasingly you have fewer and fewer children on the whole when you average it across all the members of our church. So I'm curious, let me know how many kids are in your family. If you buy into this narrative, if you see other people adopting these trends too. This is kind of a fascinating issue that I've been increasingly paying attention to, I'd say, in the past year or two. And there's a lot of worried political leaders seeing that these systems that they are presiding over are dissolving from within, and that if they don't have a rapid course correction, things are going to get really messy really quickly. See you next Sunday.